With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning on the AgNet News Hour. Coming up later, data shows pesticide use continues to decline in California. And also adverse weather and flooding are taking a toll on the production in Monterey County. But we start today with a discussion on how nanoparticles can help with plant health. I'm talking with University of Minnesota chemistry professor, Christy Haynes. All right, and you presented recently on fighting hunger with nanoparticles, and that was what I was primarily interested in. And first, I would just like for you to explain to our listeners a little bit about the background on this and what that actually means.
Sure. So I come at this from a chemist perspective, as you'd imagine, and somebody who has been doing nanoparticle design for pretty much my entire career, which doesn't sound like it necessarily has anything to do with agriculture or hunger. But when I talk about nanoparticles, first I can clarify. I mean, when you take a tiny amount of matter, shrinking it down to the size of like a virus, for example, and it has unusual chemical physical properties because you've shrunk it down to that spot, we find that we can design nanoparticles to have properties that you wouldn't find in other parts of material or molecules. And so about 8 years ago, I started thinking about how you could design nanoparticles that would be relevant in agriculture. And I say this as somebody who has never been a farmer, right? I mean, I have collaborators that are that have farms and are plant pathologists, and so I have experts talking to me. But mostly, what I was thinking about was the fact that while we have continually been able to increase the yield of crops through various agrochemicals and pesticides and other tools, I think most people know that the rate of those crop increases is actually decreasing, and that we're kind of maxing out what traditional agrochemicals can do. I think many of us know that the delivery of agrochemicals to plants to do the job we want them to do is actually pretty inefficient, and that we end up with a lot of agrochemicals in places that we don't want them. And so the thought when I first started working on this was, could we design nanoparticles that could actually make their way into a plant, either through the leaf or through the root or from a seed, that could transform into something that the plant could use so that it could essentially protect itself from disease or pests, for example. And maybe we could decrease the amount of agrochemicals that would be used, and maybe we could even use some of the plant's own kind of basic biochemical machinery to survive, to thrive, to produce more edible food that wouldn't have the same kind of downstream ecological impact. Does that make sense as an overarching concept?
It does. It does.
Okay.
The idea of using nanoparticles, it's just, I think it's fascinating. And I'm having a hard time forming questions on it, but it is so intriguing to the thought of using this science. As you know, we have a growing population, and it is going to definitely be a challenge, by 2050 to feed just the, population around the world.
Absolutely.
Has your research shown promise with this?
It has. And actually, maybe before I tell you about the promise, it's worth saying that in case people get nervous about the idea of nanoparticles, it's worth saying that there are, naturally occurring nanoparticles all around us, and there always have been. What we're doing are making nanoparticles that aren't exactly what you would find as naturally occurring particles, but we are making them from kind of the most basic elements. So the particles my group is focused on right now are all based on silica. So that's essentially the same chemical formula as sand or glass, right? So we aren't using kind of exotic elements or anything. We're trying to take kind of naturally occurring, sustainably sourced materials and essentially make them more effective by shrinking them down and designing them. And so have we seen any effectiveness? Yeah, we have actually. And it's been a little bit surprising to me how big some of the effects are. So the very first set of studies that we did, and again, this is working with a collaborator who's at the Connecticut Agriculture Experiment Station. The very first studies we did actually used watermelon, which sounds like a little bit of an unusual choice. But because we were working with these silica particles, we decided to start with a plant that we knew needed a lot of elemental silicon, because we thought if we're going to see an effect anywhere, it's going to be in something like a watermelon or a cucumber, right? These cucurbits that need silicon. And in fact, what we've seen is that we can design nanoparticles that if you do, we started by taking seedlings and kind of dipping them into the nanoparticle solution just for 5 seconds. And then we grew those in a greenhouse, and we actually took some into the field. And our results were really impressive. We saw an overall decrease in plant disease. So in this case, we had plants that were planted either in kind of uninfected soil or soil that we knew had fungal fusarium wilt in it. So we saw enhanced ability to overcome disease. And we actually saw enhanced yield of the crop. So in the 2 different studies I'm thinking of, one, we had a 70% increase in watermelon yield in the field, and the other was an 81.5% increase, which is a pretty enormous increase and was pretty exciting. So I would say, yes, we've had success, and we don't really want to do this just in watermelon, of course, that's considered a specialty crop. And so our newest data is actually seeing how well this translates into some crops that are not known to be kind of silicon accumulators. And so we have some new data in soybean, which is trying to approach that. And we see some exciting effects there, less in yield and more in overcoming crop disease and biofortification, actually, of micronutrients.
You're listening to the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. In today's international spotlight, some growers in central Canada are considering adding fall-seeded winter canola to their crop rotation. Dana Sky has more.
The majority of Canadian canola acres are grown in the Prairie Province as a spring-seeded crop, but the oilseed crop is also grown in Ontario. That province is approaching 50,000 canola acres, with most of those acres spring-seeded. Spring canola is planted in early spring and usually harvested in September. Conversely, winter canola is planted in the early fall, then overwinters, and is typically harvested in late June or July. Since 2018, winter canola acreage in Ontario has expanded from just 500 seeded acres to well over 10,000 acres planted last fall. The reason for this acreage expansion is simple. A winter canola crop can yield 20 to 30% more than a spring canola crop. Megan Moran, canola specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Food, says that the vast majority of winter canola acres are grown in southwestern Ontario, west of Toronto. And while spring canola still commands the larger acreage, southern Ontario growers with winter canola in their rotation, at least to this point, are pleased with results.
In Ontario, we have about 45,000 acres of canola each year, and about 1/3 of it is winter canola. A lot of growers I've talked to have said this has been their most profitable crop. A couple reasons for that. Prices are really strong over the past few years. Good overwintering success and strong yields. It's often almost double what we see in spring canola. The average is around 70 bushels. That's kind of the goal. I hear a lot into 80, 85 bushels.
When it comes to planting conditions, conventional tillage is recommended over no-till application, and Ontario canola specialist Megan Moran says that getting winter canola into the ground at the right time is a primary key to success for this crop.
The keys to success with this crop, planting window and seeding into good conditions. We like to recommend tillage because residue harbors slugs, and we've had a lot of issues with slugs in the fall. So in terms of seeding date, we need about 600 growing degree days before your first fall frost. That'll help us get enough growth to survive the winter.
Canola specialist Megan Moran says that while winter canola can be a fit with most crop rotation strategies, there are some restrictions in rotation for the best winter canola crop outcome.
We have to plant this crop either in August or September, depending where you are, and so it's really only after winter wheat or after an oat crop. And after we harvest our canola, we're either seeding double crop soybeans or maybe a cover crop of oats, and then following with corn in the spring. Some growers will follow winter canola with another winter cereal or another cereal in the spring.
Reporting from Canada, I'm Dennis Guy.
A windstorm hit the Midwest, but the damage doesn't seem to be as bad as other events. Here's David Geiger.
There was an official derecho across the Midwest mid-July from Iowa to Illinois, including Chicago, Indiana, and southwest Michigan. In Des Moines, Iowa's state climatologist Justin Glissing gives a reminder of what defines a derecho.
At least 240 miles in path length, 60 miles wide, and within that swath, wind gusts to 58 miles per hour or above. So this is a concentrated windstorm that went over 500 miles. We had a tornado spun up in the metro, EF1. The ranking just came out, 105 mile per hour winds. So lots of rain, lots of thunder and lightning with these. The towers got up 70,000 feet, which is about double a passenger airplane flies.
And this event is a self-perpetuating system.
We've seen several. In fact, I can't count on one hand the amount of derechos that we've had over the last 5 or 6 years. So we were in a configuration for this, that heat dome finally moved off, but the system moved along the periphery of it, and that's what was able to fuel it.
While Illinois seems to have received the brunt of the wind, GLSEN reached out to field agronomists in Iowa, finding this windstorm didn't appear to be as damaging as other derechos.
Some tilted over corn. Not seeing widespread issues right now, but definitely not on the scale of that August 10th, 2020 derecho with widespread 80 mile per hour plus winds across much of eastern Iowa, particularly those 100 plus readings around Cedar Rapids and east central Iowa. But we're going to see some damage from this.
In Des Moines, Iowa, I'm David Geiger reporting.
That's today's National Spotlight. Now here's the Livestock Report with Gary Crawford.
The nation's beef producers are continuing to turn out more beef than most analysts had been expecting.
But we're still looking at more than a billion-pound contraction in beef supply year over year.
2024 to 2025. USDA's chief economist Seth Meyer says steer prices are, of course, already very high.
And we're seeing pretty solid demand in the beef market and seeing very high steer prices and an expectation that we will have a record high forecast price for steers in 2025 as we continue to see the number of slaughter available animals fall.
USDA is forecasting steer prices next year to average $190.50 per hundredweight. That's $364 higher than this year's season average price. For the nation's turkey producers, this is a time of
pretty low producer returns through this year. Prices have been under some pressure for quite a while.
And USDA Outlook Board Chairman Mark Jekanowski says the question now is, what are producers going to do about it?
We did see at least a little bit of an indication of lower hatchery numbers in one of the recent reports. Too soon to read too much into that, but it might suggest some tightening up of supplies into 2025 as maybe producers start to cut back production a bit.
USDA currently is projecting turkey production next year to increase, but only by about 1% or so. Prices expected to average possibly 11% higher than this year. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. We will be back in just a moment with more agriculture news. Coming up in a few moments, we'll have today's This Land of Ours report, but first, more of the day's agriculture news. And with a preview of what you'll hear today on AgNet West, here's Brian German.
According to the latest Monterey County crop report, adverse weather and flooding last year took a toll on crop values. The 2023 report shows a 6.1% decline in crop values from the previous year with a total production value of $4.3 billion. Crop values were impacted by market demand and labor challenges. However, the decrease was mainly due to severe flooding in January and March and below average temperatures. Extensive flooding damaged over 20,000 acres of farmland, and the cool weather in spring and summer further delayed crop growth. Despite a decline of 5.7% in value, strawberries remained the top crop at nearly $904 million, followed by leaf lettuce and head lettuce. Overall vegetable crop value declined by 7.9%, while perennial crops that were less affected by rain saw improvements with a 12% increase in wine grape value. A study from Purdue University has found that most Americans know little about the U.S. Farm Bill being debated in Congress. A survey of 1,200 people showed that about a third have never heard of the Farm Bill, and another third don't know its programs. The Farm Bill, worth millions, impacts the entire food system. The survey also explored consumer priorities, finding that while taste, affordability, and nutrition are top grocery shopping values, affordability and nutrition are also Farm Bill priorities, but taste is not. Environmental sustainability ranks higher for the Farm Bill than for personal shopping. The survey-based report out of Purdue University's Center for Food Demand Analysis and Sustainability found that despite political differences, there's broad bipartisan support for farm subsidies and nutrition assistance like SNAP. Inflation perceptions vary by political view, with conservatives expecting higher inflation than liberals. The survey also highlighted that liberals score higher on sustainable food practices and are more likely to eat vegetarian or vegan diets and choose eco-friendly food options. However, all political groups agree on the environmental benefits of local food. A recent report from the USDA shows that American specialty crop exports to China have been on the decline over the past several years. While tree nut exports have increased significantly between 2017 and 2023, fresh fruit exports have declined from $226 million to $86 million, largely due to improved Chinese domestic production, retaliatory tariffs, and free trade agreements with competitors. Despite tariffs, U.S. tree nuts remain popular in China, but market share has declined. Fresh fruit exports have plummeted due to increased competition from high-quality domestic and imported products. Processed fruit exports have also dropped by 48% since 2017, while fresh and processed vegetable exports have decreased due to China's increased local production. The U.S. must focus on targeted marketing to maintain its market share in China amidst the ongoing challenges. Multiple factors are pushing butter prices to record-breaking levels. Senior dairy analyst with Rabo AgriFinance, Lucas Fees, said that demand is only part of the driving force behind increased prices.
A lot of it is being driven by demand coming either from consumers who continue to purchase higher and higher amounts of product at the grocery store, but a lot of it is also at the food service level, where restaurants, other companies finding that consumers recognize that cooking with butter tastes better. It can improve the quality of their product. It's a single ingredient product, which is also appealing. Butter's kind of shifted itself into this world of healthy fats. And then also there's been limited investment in new butter plants as well. So we haven't necessarily yet been able to build new butter plants to meet this heightened demand, which just kind of creates some of the firm demand trends that we're seeing in this market overall.
Pesticide use in California dropped by over 5% from 2021 to 2022, continuing an ongoing trend. The latest annual report from the California Department of Pesticide Regulation highlights significant declines over the past decade in the use of what the department classifies as higher-risk pesticides. In 2022, 181 million pounds of pesticide active ingredients were used, marking a 10.4 million pound decrease from the previous year. The cumulative acres treated also fell by 3.2%. As regulations continue to shift in California, the use of biopesticides has increased significantly during the period between 2013 and 2022. Pounds of biopesticides have increased by 56%, equating to a 30% increase in cumulative acres. The pesticide use report is compiled using data collected from county agricultural commissioners. I'm Brian German for AgNet West Radio Network.
A new investment in conservation projects. That's coming up on This Land of Ours. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is investing $90 million in 53 conservation innovation grant projects, which support the development of new tools, approaches, practices, and technologies to further natural resource conservation on private lands. This year, the increased funds were available because of President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which is funding the projects that address climate change, with a particular focus on innovative solutions to reduce livestock emissions of methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas emission. USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, is awarding more than $69.7 million for these on-farm trial projects and more than $20.2 million for classic projects. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack announced the grants during an Investing in America roundtable in Pennsylvania, while highlighting USDA programs focused on innovative climate strategies. You're listening to the AgNet News Hour. The latest efforts by the Agriculture Department and other stakeholders in efforts to reduce our domestic food loss and waste by half by the year 2030 was recently announced. It's a federal strategy which includes the increased recycling of organic materials. Rod Bain looks at some of the components within this strategy in this edition of Agriculture USA.
It's an effort within our nation going on almost a decade now.
In 2015, USDA and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency set a national goal to cut food loss and waste in half by 2030.
Gene Busby has been involved in these efforts for several years now as USDA's food loss and waste liaison. That includes a recently announced national strategy to expedite food loss and waste reduction efforts, as well as increase recycling of organic materials. I'm Rod Bain. Coming up, a look at components of this new strategic framework and how it relates to existing food loss and waste reduction efforts in this edition of Agriculture USA. What are the pillars of a new national strategy focused on reducing food loss and waste and recycling organics in our country?
To prevent food loss, prevent food waste, increase the recycling rate for all organic waste, to support policies that incentivize and encourage the prevention of food loss and waste and organics recycling.
That's Jean Busby. She is USDA's Food Loss and Waste Liaison within the Office of the Chief Economist. She says the recently announced national strategy is a joint effort created by the White House, the Agriculture Department, Environmental Protection Agency, and Food and Drug Administration.
It's been in the cooker for a while.
With the draft strategy first released in December 2022, followed by a period of public comment that included over 10,000 responses.
These actions outlined in the national strategy really identify concrete steps and complementary USDA, EPA, and FDA actions that are really going to accelerate the prevention of food loss and waste where possible and the recycling of organic waste.
That acceleration's importance, according to Busby, is noted in the federal government's goal to reduce domestic food loss and waste by the year 2030.
1/3 of all food produced for human consumption never gets eaten by people. In fact, food is the single most common material found in landfills, and 61% of methane generated by decomposing landfill food waste is not captured by landfill gas collection systems and is released into the atmosphere.
Some examples of actions that can be taken through the strategy by USDA and stakeholders include the following.
To optimize the harvest or collection of raw commodities and food, such as to get excess wholesome food to those in need, such as through the emergency food assistance programs, farm to food bank projects, to really educate and engage children and youth about food waste and ways to reduce it. The collection and processing of food loss and waste and other organic materials, such as yard and tree trimmings, that would otherwise be landfilled or incinerated, and turning them into new products, such as soil amendments from composting food scraps and soaps and bone meal from rendering, will provide subject matter expertise and technical assistance to help federal agency, tribes, territories, states, and local governments as requested on policy approaches and options to reduce food loss and waste.
The various aspects of this national food loss and waste reduction and organic recycling strategy build upon existing collaborative efforts started almost a decade ago. One example, funding of urban composting and food waste reduction pilot projects for the past 5 years through USDA's Office of Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production.
The CFWR Cooperative Agreement Program this year will be jointly administering the program between the Office of Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production, as well as USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. OUAIP will accept applications on grants.gov until September 4th. The projects must be 2 years in duration with an estimated start date of June 1st, 2025.
Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production Director Brian Gussie notes the diversity of collaboration within these cooperative agreements.
These agreements are led by local governments and other eligible entities,
such as schools and tribal governments. The area of focus within these proposed pilot projects include
create compost, increase access to compost for agricultural producers, reduce reliance on and limit the use of fertilizer, improve soil quality, encourage waste management and permaculture business development, increase rainwater absorption, reduce municipal food waste, and divert food waste from landfills.
More details about USDA and federal government food loss and waste reduction efforts can be found online at www.usda.gov/food loss and waste, all one word. This has been Agriculture USA. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
A new report suggests that food price inflation is leveling off. Here's Gary Crawford with more.
I'm fairly confident that we're headed in the right direction.
The right direction. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack's reaction the other day after looking at the latest Consumer Food Price Index report, which showed another month of zero grocery store food price inflation. USDA economist Megan Schweitzer told us.
So this month in particular, we saw food at home prices were flat over the month. And in fact, food at home prices have been flat for 3 out of the 4 most recent months.
And Ag Secretary Vilsack told reporters that compared to prices a year ago,
The grocery store cost of food is now at an inflation rate of a little over 1%, which is well below the 20-year average for the inflation rate for food purchased from the grocery store.
on average, food prices generally go up each year by about 2.5%. During the height of COVID, the inflation rate was as high as 11.5%. But since then, and especially this year,
we've seen prices for groceries in particular really level off.
with some foods dropping in price, some others going up. In fact, during June, of the 15 food categories that Megan tracks,
in June, prices rose for 7 categories, declined for 6 categories, and stayed the same for 2 categories. So really, that was what was leading to our no change overall, was sort of that balance between those categories declining and rising.
On the list of price declines during June,
prices fell the most for fresh fruits. Prices were down by 2.6% in June. And so this is at least partially a seasonal factor, where prices fall when fresh fruits come into season domestically. Fresh vegetables as well, we've seen declining prices for 4 months straight.
Overall, price declines month by month have taken prices for some foods down below what they were a year ago at this time.
Prices for fish and seafood are 1% lower than they were a year ago. Prices for fresh fruits are 1.7% lower than they were a year ago. Fresh vegetables are down by 0.3%. And dairy products are down just a smidge by 0.1%.
On the flip side, several products are selling for higher prices than this time a year ago, such as fats and oils. That includes butter. Those fats and oil products are 4% higher. Beef is over 5% higher. And eggs are still costing 10% more than they did this time last year. Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
This is the AgNet News Hour, and we will be back in just a moment with more agriculture news. Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. We continue now with our discussion on how nanoparticles can help plant health. I'm talking with University of Minnesota chemistry professor Christy Haynes. You mentioned fusarium, and that actually is a big problem for a lot of our growers.
Absolutely.
And there's, it's very difficult to fight. So having something like this, I think it would be very interesting to growers, just to this type of new technology being developed and researched. I always think that research is just so important, and funding for research is so important so that we can continue things like this going. Where did the idea for this come from?
Yeah, so it started, I'm lucky enough to be part of a big research center. So I help run a big research center called the Center for Sustainable Nanotechnology that's actually funded by the National Science Foundation. And the NSF typically they want fundamental research for the most part, although in recent years they've been leaning more applied. And so my research group at the University of Minnesota had been designing all these nanoparticles, and we were studying fundamental properties of them. And then, of course, I'm lucky enough to come in contact with people in a wide variety of scientific areas. And so I met Jason White, the man I mentioned, who's at the Connecticut Agriculture Experiment Station. And we started talking about plants. And to be honest, I had been designing these nanoparticles for human health related issues originally. So we were designing particles that could be sensors in the body and let you do some MRI imaging or deliver cancer therapeutics. And so I'd spent almost a decade trying to figure out how to stabilize the particles. And essentially, when I started thinking about the fact that plants need silicon, they take it in the form of silicic acid, and that's the byproduct of what happens when our nanoparticles are in water. All the things we learned to stabilize the particles, we essentially did the reverse for plants. We realized we could purposefully make the nanoparticles transform. And so if we could just get them inside a plant, and it turns out it's a lot easier to get nanoparticles in a plant than it is to get them to a person or an organ, then we knew that we could let them undergo their natural reaction in water, and it would produce the silicic acid. And I think what's really important about this is it's actually making use of the plant's kind of natural machinery, right? And what these plants do commonly is they assimilate silicon essentially from the soil. They move it into the plant, and then essentially they deposit it to build strong cell walls and to fortify their leaves, which is part of why they survive disease. And we're essentially just giving them an extra bit of the molecule so they don't have to assimilate it from the soil. And they're using all of their natural machinery. So this is really more like a probiotic than, a medicine, for example. And I think that's a really smart way to go after challenges like this, is don't introduce anything that's not supposed to be there, but maybe you can produce more, or upregulate the function of something that is naturally occurring in the plant.
And I think that's a good, it's good to make sure that that is clear as well, especially when you're talking about food. There, people, obviously people are very protective over their food
Yeah.
and food sources. So, when GMO technology was being developed, and even still, there is such a battle against it. In order to kind of, curb that, how would you explain to lay people who are wondering, what are you doing with our food and how is
Yeah,
it going to affect things?
I was definitely aware of this. I mean, I had watched how nano in Europe was being regulated in a really similar way to the way GMOs were. And of course, I don't want to lose any of the tools that we need in order to figure out how we're going to feed people on the planet. So the way I would explain this to the layperson is, it's essentially like we're taking grains of sand, making them a little bit smaller, making them so they're more likely to dissolve. So honestly, the fact that nanoparticles are naturally occurring, the fact that silica is naturally occurring, we're literally just making it so that the plant has an easier time processing it. And when we're doing these studies where we're tracking how a plant does in disease conditions or how much crop grows, I will say we are also analyzing to see if there's more silicon appearing in different parts of the plant. And we've actually verified in the watermelon study, I can say for sure, the soybean is still in progress, that we see no increased silicon content in the edible part of the plant. So even though I'm not worried about the safety of the particle because it's so much like something that the environment already produces, if a consumer is, I can say we're verifying that we're not seeing any increased silica. So essentially what that means is they're getting into the plants, they're dissolving, they're doing their work, in the xylem, in the leaves, and it's not actually ending up in the edible portion, which I think is what people are probably likely to be most nervous about.
Yeah. And you're right. And that's the part that people, I think, care the most about.
Yeah.
Is what is ending up in the edible parts of these plants. So you started with watermelons, researching now with soybeans. Any other crops in mind?
Yeah, we we have some nanoparticles on some corn plants this summer, which is I'm in the Midwest, and so that's an interesting place to go. I'm not sure what the outcome of that will be. I'll know a lot more in September and October whether silicon nanoparticles are effective there. But I'll be honest, I know when I talk to people who are interested in corn, I know that they are most concerned about zinc in corn. And so we've actually been working on some preliminary projects where maybe we can think instead of silica, or maybe in addition to silica, we can do something that's kind of more crop specific. We have a little bit of data in tomato, a little bit in potato, actually. And in general, we see these trends emerging. The silica nanoparticle, I think, is going to be one that is generally going to be useful for a wide range of plants, largely because, of course, plants, all of them, use silica in their basic structure. I think the effects are going to be bigger in some plants than in others. And we do overall see that we get the best effects when a plant is exposed either at a seedling stage, usually in the kind of first week after being above the ground. And so this is about something that's happening early in the plant's development. I'd love to do more research where we understand, the fundamental underpinnings of that mechanism. That made me realize actually that you did ask me about funding. I mentioned that this started as a National Science Foundation project. Since then, we have actually picked up some funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture as well. So we do have a more applied bit of funding letting us do this work now.
Excellent. And I always like to ask about funding because, when I do reporting on other things like Farm Bill or legislation that includes funding for research, it's nice for people to see this is why funding for research is so important.
It's so critically important. And I think that sometimes I think a lot about my responsibility to the taxpayer all the time when I'm doing this work. And I think that sometimes it's easy to think that we only need to fund kind of the end of this, right? That I have something that works and how do I commercialize it? But the truth is, if we stop funding the kind of fundamental research, the very beginning research, we won't have anything in the pipeline for that commercialization piece. And so I think that's why the story of this is very interesting, is because it started out as a basic, how do we understand how nanoparticles transform, which maybe doesn't sound that interesting to, your average citizen. But when it becomes everything we learned about how it transforms means that we can design them so that we can grow enough food to feed people, then it becomes really important. And so I am definitely an advocate for, both basic and applied scientific funding.
So is there anything else that you would like for our listeners to know about your research, or really about anything along these lines, as we kind of wind up here? Is there anything that you think that they should know, or is there a take-home message, or is there someplace online, if they're like very interested in this and want to learn more and maybe read more about your research, any of that available online for people to look through?
Yeah, certainly they could look at, primary scientific literature if they, have access to those articles. We are publishing those papers, they're being peer reviewed and all of those things. Maybe of more interest, I did give a TED talk about this. So I gave a 12-minute version of the beginning of this story. And I worked really hard on that to kind of talk about what I was passionate about and how I got started doing it and what the early results were. We've come a long way since then, but I still think that's a good place to look. And I guess the big message, you kind of already touched on for me, which is, I think, one, having folks that are doing agricultural work be open-minded to new technologies. I know that they are. I hear about robots and drones and all kinds of, implant sensors, for example. I think being open to this technology is good. I also think advocating to our legislators to continue to fund both basic and applied research is a really important thing to do. And I can say that I am in the early stages of actually some commercialization on this, which is not something that I ever imagined doing, right? I'm a chemist, I'm comfortable with students in a lab. But you can look at the website of this company that's been launched called Convergent Bioscience. And we're just at the very earliest of stages, just starting to do some collaborative work with some of the bigger companies in the ag industry that are interested in maybe bringing a nano component to all the other products that they make. So that's one avenue I have never expected to be involved in, but it feels really important for a problem as big as feeding the people on our planet.
You're listening to the AgNet News Hour. Wrapping up our news for today, interested parties have until September 13th to comment on a proposed rule offering modifications to federal milk marketing orders. Rod Bain has more.
The comment period is now underway for the proposed rule modifying parts of federal milk marketing orders.
It provides a 60-day comment period for anyone who has an interest in providing USDA comments on our recommendations. They will have until September 13th to provide us with that information.
Agricultural Marketing Service Deputy Administrator Dana Cole says comments are accepted through the Federal Register.
Once we get those comments in, USDA will have 60 days to take those comments, make any modifications, and issue what is called a final decision. That final decision must be issued by November 12th.
Followed by a vote by dairy producers. Cole says if approved, milk marketing order modifications would be implemented in early 2025. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
That's today's top agriculture news. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. Thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West online at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also find our broadcast team of Brian German and Sabrina Halvorson on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.